that God will not destroy a city. And he haggles him 10. So Abraham, up to this point, and I think many of us can relate, that every time God has kind of urged you towards something, your major response is not, here I am. And our tension is the time when God calls us in obedience, we usually say, here he is, or here she is, or here is the missionaries, here's that church that's doing it. Rarely, and we can relate to this, do we say, here I am? And this calling that God is calling him to, and the important thing right now is, God did not call Abraham to kill his son, but he said to sacrifice him as an offering. And he's challenging Abraham with a single thing that for him, his whole life was surrounded on this one particular blessing. And it felt like an incredible reversal of fortune. He's been given this wonderful son, this incredibly good thing, and everything surrounded on this promise. And God tested him, this one fortune, this one promise, the son whom he loved. As I said earlier, it's the first time used in the Bible. And this word is better translated in Hebrew as hesed, or kindness. It is the first time the word love is used in the Bible in this way to describe a relationship between a father and a son. And sometimes, and oftentimes, the call in our lives feels like it will destroy your world, because it challenges us in a crisis of faith to examine what you really love and to see if it is God that you love. And you continue to grasp that call and sacrifice because in reality, what you're missing out in that call is faith. I remember in 1999, God called me to work at Chinese Christian Herald Crusades in Chinatown. Chinese Christian Herald Crusades is a community center serving Chinese youth, immigrant youth in Chinatown. And at that time, I was engaged. I had a wonderful fiance, and I just bought a co-op in Queens. And I was working in a nonprofit as a director. And I was making a lot of money. Even though it was nonprofit, it was within development work. So I was fundraising, and I was making quite a bit. And one Sunday, I went to church. And I remember the pastor, Tim Keller, my pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, was preaching on just how to be more creative in our way of thinking about evangelism, how we talk about God to other people. And I remember sitting there listening, and all of a sudden there was this huge burden in my heart. And I would say it was the first time I really felt a calling in my life. And I felt he was saying, leave your job, there's something greater for you. Now you have to understand, I went to NYU, not Harvard, unfortunately. My parents still bother me about that. I didn't go to Harvard, I went to NYU. I didn't go to Cornell, but I married a woman from Cornell, so my mom is semi-happy. And I had this co-op, which I had a mortgage to pay, but I went in faith and said, I'm going to do this. Next day I went into work and I gave him my 2 weeks notice, not knowing what I was going to do. Now, some people say that's foolish, but it was a time of crisis where I said with my community group, I was a part of a Bible study group, I told them I feel like I need to leave. Even though I was doing well and happy and comfortable, I felt a strong urge to leave, and they all supported me. Within 2 months, I was helping out with this organization called Hope for New York, and they asked me to go to Chinese Christian Herald Crusades to interview them because they gave them money as part of their funding. So I went there to help. And they interviewed the director, and the director says, I asked her, what is your greatest need right now? And she says, we need a youth worker that can help with gang kids, intervention at the courts, and do some translation in Chinese. And I sat there going, wow, you just said my testimony. Because I was in a gang when I was a teenager. I can translate in Chinese. And I said, this could be something. But then I asked her, are you looking for a full-time worker? She says, yes. And I said, oh, what's the pay? And she told me the pay. And I was like, what? Is this full-time or part-time? She said, that's my full-time pay. And I went, oh my goodness. And as I prayed more and more, I felt God was telling a story through my life, and I went in. To make a long story short, my parents disowned me. My parents are not Christians. They didn't understand. They thought I joined a cult. And I couldn't pay my mortgage because I wasn't able to afford it anymore. But I was willing to move in with the pastor. Within a month, my parents disowned me, wasn't returning my phone calls. And then what happened was I had to ask them to take care of my mortgage of my co-op. My mom was furious. And as it would have it, that she would have to come in and sign. I had to sign these papers over to her through a lawyer. And it was the day that I was at the youth center, and I was the only person there. And I also remember that early on that year, because I just came to faith a few years prior to that. My God said, this is the year that I'm going to restore your relationship with your parents. I'm going to use you as a witness to them because you have changed, your life has changed, and I thought that this was the year, and I was confused. So my mom was coming to the youth center. She said, I need you to sign the papers. I need you to come downstairs and fill them out. And I said, I cannot. And she says, why not? And I said, I have the youth center. I'm by myself. There's like 20 kids here. I can't leave them by themselves. And she goes, you can't leave them for 5 minutes? I said, I can't leave them for 5 minutes because I leave them for 5 minutes, they're going to steal everything. Because they're like street kids. So I said, no, I can't. So you either come up or we don't sign the papers. And I don't know what else I can do. She wound up really getting angry. She comes up with my mother and father, and she says, here's the papers, fill it out. And I went to my office and I prayed and I started weeping. And I said, God, you want me to witness to them. I feel like losing my parents. And you said I was going to gain them. I have this job that, for the most part, is going to set me off financially. And number 3, I was really miserable in ministry because I felt there was too many kids. It's only one of me. And I felt like I wasn't really producing a lot of fruit. So I come back out after I prayed, and my mother looks at me with tears in her eyes, and she says, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I was shocked. I said, what just happened? I look at my father. My father says, it's okay. We're just going to go out for dinner. We go out for dinner. My parents did not exchange one single word with me. We just ate. And she said, sign the papers. Sign the papers. And I went back home, and I asked my dad what happened. My mother went into her bedroom. My father says, while you were in the office, we were waiting for you. A couple of the kids came up to us. William, one of the first kids I ever worked with, was a street kid, and he hung out in the streets, got involved in gangs. I pulled him out of the streets and had him hang out. Both his parents were in Hong Kong. Sent him to the United States to go study, but he had no parents, but I took him in. William goes up to my parents and says, who are you? And they said, I'm Peter's mom and dad. And William says, thank you, Mrs. Ong, for your son. Because without him, I wouldn't have been able to finish junior high school. Second kid comes. Who are you? I'm Peter, mom and dad. And they're like, you are. He's really helped me a lot in my schoolwork. And one by one, about 4 or 5 kids went up to them to thank them. And my mom remembered that we were once immigrants. We came here when I was 5, and how hard it was. And here I am serving this group of people that were just basically like me. And sometimes God's call in our lives feels like that. It feels like on the left side, things are falling apart, and the right, there's things falling apart, front and back. Everything is falling apart for you. And God is saying something to us profoundly in that call to us. And for a lot of you, you're not called to ministry. You're like, well, I'm not called like you. But each one of you called towards a cross that you're called to bear of obedience. Some of you, it could be about your private lives and the way you have relationships, your purity. Some of you, it could be your material things and the way that God's calling you to give up some things. Some of you are so holding on to your education like it's the ultimate thing in your life. And it is important because for most of you, student is your primary calling, but it's not your ultimate calling. And it feels like God's killing you if he takes that away from you. And here's Abraham's response. He goes on to 3 days of walking towards the mountain. He enters in and he says, this is where we're going to build an altar. Now, if anyone who knows anything about the Old Testament, when you build an altar, you're doing what? Preparing sacrifice to worship God. And Abraham is saying, he enters in this incredibly frightening and horrific calling. And his first instinct is to worship him. When you sang songs today, when you live your lives, that is your primary call, is to worship. What does that mean? When you do your homework, I tell my youth group all the time, you don't know it, but that is an act of worship. When you're at work, for those of you young adults, the minute you clock in at 9 o'clock, even when you're commuting to work, is an act of worship. Worship is not designated for Sunday. You don't compartmentalize one day out of the whole week as your time of worship, but all of your life is worship. But Sunday is your convergence, not your compartmentalization. And here's Abraham in the midst of this horrific call, and he built an altar. And he goes, we're going to go and worship. And finally, his answer to this horrific call is to obey. It's the only part in the whole Bible when Isaac and Abraham talks to each other. And do you think as Abraham was walking, he's saying, I could do it. He's saying, I could do this. I can kill him. I can offer him. I just need enough strength. Let me just do this. And for so many of us as Christians, that's what we've been told. That if you just be like Abraham, just be strong, trust, and just do it. You can kill your son. You can kill your son. You can kill the one thing that's most primary for you. But that's not what the verse is saying. He is saying, Abraham is saying, no, not that I could do it, but he says, the Lord will provide. God will do it. And after this whole episode happens, which is so profound, he doesn't say, I'm going to name this mountain, I will obey. He does not name the mountain, I will worship. He will not name the mountain, look at courage to do what is wrong. But he said, I will name this mountain, the Lord will provide. So it's not that he can do it. And that's not what he's saying. He said, I can do it, but he's saying the Lord will provide. In Hebrew, the word is Jehovah. And Jehovah Jireh means the Lord will provide. More subtle, nuanced way of what the Bible says is the Lord sees. Not only will I provide, but I'm seeing everything that's happening before you. Nothing in your life is a surprise. And why would God say, now I know that you fear me? That is a very odd statement, especially if you believe in the theology that God knows everything. Why would he say, now I know you fear me? Anytime in the Bible when God asks a question, it's not because he needs information or he doesn't know the answer. But rather, I think, and the Bible tells us, Abraham lacked information about himself. He asked this question, and he challenges us to really know, do you know enough about who you are? Do you know that in your obedience, you're showing not me what you're capable of, but I'm showing you what you're capable in me. And that's when our faith becomes real. It's It's a way of God purifying us. And many of us in this room